Oh, hello.
She's new, isn't she?
Yeah, she sounds pretty sexy. This week's Welsh Wednesdays is very opportune because I got a frigging fine from Runcorn Bridge
Again?
yesterday.
Oh my
Yeah,
god.
never mind Rebecca Riots. It's going to be frigging Katie kickoff soon because welcome Croeso Welsh Wednesdays with me, Katie Gill-Williams and Kiri Pritchard-McLean, where every week we have a sgwrs bach amdan pwnc gwahanol, different subject, something we find interesting, and try and summarise in Welsh at the end and try and find some new words. So this week we're doing Rebecca Riots. I never learnt about it at school, obviously school in England, but the very kind of reductive version of it was in the early 1800s, so 1830s and 40s, I think it was. There were these toll gates, so there was like toll fines for certain sections of Wales, and there was big disputes about it and lots of riots to kind of fight against these toll fines, and then they took them away and all was well. And it was quite a distinctive movement because the people who were protesting or rioting would dress as well, women, but essentially they don't really focus on that too much. I think there's some schools of thought that believe they kind of remove gender from it, and I don't know whether that's to kind of make their point a bit more. And they say it's almost like non-binary. They don't kind of sit firmly in men or women category really. So that's a very simplistic version, but actually when you delve a little bit deeper, it's got more significant meaning really.
One tiny correction I'd like to make, that is being coloured by your own personal experience, in that you're saying that they were fighting against toll fines, and they weren't. They were just fighting against tolls. You were like, they're rallying against the fines, probably something to do with the Wirral. So it's like one of those toll bridges that basically was like any business person could build a road and they could put as many tolls along it as they wanted to. And the people, from my understanding, that affected loads was the tenanted farmers, who were the poorer farmers. They weren't the landowners, they rented farms, which meant often their farms and fields were far away, so they would have to use the roads to efficiently get between the farmland because it wasn't joined in any way.
Yeah, there was heavy toll on the way to Cardiff, and they were penalised because already they were in an environment and socially at the time they were really poor. And I think what kind of happened, it was like early industrial revolution really, but there's the suggestion that Cardiff and South Wales in particular was almost like industrial revolution but on steroids. Like everything was, because of the resources in Wales, everything was driven, and capitalism kind of had really strong roots in South Wales. So yeah, these farmers were kind of very poor in society, but had to kind of navigate these quite capitalist like the beginnings of capitalism really. That narrative and that kind of redacted version of the story kind of suits a government agenda. I'm straight in with the theories there.
Love a conspiracy.
The reason they were called Rebecca Wrights, there's two kind of schools of thought about it. So the first one is literally after someone who was called Rebecca, and she happened to be like the biggest woman in the village, because the first person who did it, who's called Thomas Rees, so he was a boxer and he was just this really huge, massive 6-foot guy, and they were like, gonna need a frock. So they just went to visit this girl called Rebecca, or Big Becca as she was known. And so there's that idea, but there's also from the biblical sense. So there's a story about Rebecca and her children who were told to go and rally against and take back gates or something like that. So
Yeah, from like unscrupulous business owners. So it does mirror the story that's happening.
the first recorded incident was 1839, I think, and that was in Carmarthenshire.
Yeah.
And what sort of happened with that one was they all kind of grouped together in the night. These essentially it did start off as farmers, farm hands I think came in a bit later on, but yes, the farmers to kind of protest against these extortionate tolls. And they just took down this one toll booth, and like a few weeks later, like the bourgeoisie got together and like, oh, it's fine, we'll just replace it and we'll put it back up. And they did it 4 times. They were just like, no. So they just kept going down and taking this one toll. And that was the impetus and the catalyst, I think, for the movement as it was. Initially, it seemed to be done less violently, and then kind of spread its wings a little bit.
Yeah, I think it feels like so many other movements in that, like, so it just started as like a social uprising to correct an exploitative, financially exploitative system that was especially exploiting working class people, in this case farmers. And then what happened is it feels like people got wind of it, and then people, I'm always quite cynical with stuff like this, like most, you know, movements that start from a positive place, I think they can be co-opted by people who love a fight. Do you know what I mean? Like the people who would be like, you saw it during the pandemic, that there'll be people at various protests, whether it's Black Lives Matter or anti-lockdown protests, who would kick off because they weren't at the football kicking off with each other. They just want a bundle. It's like young lads who like fighting, so they'll co-opt movements, and it's really, you know, it must be so difficult if you're a part of that movement when you're like, we have a single goal, and you know, so often to legitimize your protest you have to be peaceful with it, and you know, you can't smash things up, and then people who've got nothing to do with what you're doing come along and do it. And then obviously the cynical conspiracy theorist part of me is like, oh, that's the other side do that kind of thing deliberately to undermine it, and people go, oh, there was violent clashes at, you know, Black Lives Matter, and then people get to say, oh, well, it's a violent movement, when it's not. It's, you know, it's not even it. I don't even think it's even a contingent of those people. I think it's people who go along because they like a fight.
I liked the grassroots and the start of what the Rebecca Riots stood for, because I think they were much more than the toll charges. They were kind of they were fighting for, you know, reforms in the poor law as well. Essentially, to get help, you'd have to plead poverty, but you'd have to go to a panel, and it would be decided what type of poor you are, like whether you're a desirable poor, you know, are you actually a bit like, do you need benefits? Are you a scrounger? So the parallels to today are just so gross. And what they kind of did instead of that was they go, right, okay, well, we'll scrap that, but we'll just start these workhouses, and we all know how well those ended up. So the bourgeoisie were kind of trying to show, oh, we're listening and we're making reforms and changes, but it was always to the detriment and would leave them worse off. So one of the protests they'd organised to go and to go to a toll gate and to destroy it, but on the way it was kind of diverted to this poorhouse, and that ended up ablaze. And the reporting on that one was, like these vigilantes have come in, they've caused all this violence, but essentially they sent in the military, who were, you know, kind of attacking non-armed women and children, and it was pretty brutal.
Possible, isn't it, for an uprising in that way? It's just any foot out of line, any mistake, you know, something catches fire that wasn't meant to, and then that's it. Like, because the papers are there to uphold the establishment as well, and then, you know, the person on the street who's never even heard, is not from that area, has never heard of the Rebecca Riots, has made a snap judgment about those people and what they stand for, and oh, they're just thugs, and they're just, you know, it's just violence for violence sake, and, you know, they're vandals, as opposed to like, actually, no, these are people who are standing up for what they believe is right, and for sort of like their fellow countrymen, I guess.
In total, it was just only over 4 years, but I think it was reported for like one of the years, just literally Carmarthen was just on fire for like a year, just ablaze, I think was the description. But I do think they start out from a moral place, and they're fighting for people who can't necessarily fight for themselves. And I am a big union fan, and I think it feels like a great grassroots unionism, just in a really quite early stage. So I think that's why it's really cool. Well-to-do kind of farmers were kind of moving to the cities, and the cities were so gross at that time, like early Victorian era. It just makes you think, like, what were they living in to think that that was a better scenario? But rather than manage their land, they'd send maybe like an English landlord, or it just feels like, I don't know, it just feels like landlordism. It's so complex, this situation, and it feels like so many things that are similar to now. Like there's this house just gone for sale. It's a beautiful chapel in on the Llyn, and there's a massive uprising because it's just been sold to someone as to be made into a holiday home rather than conserve any of the history and you know, have any kind of compassion or care about the building around it. So these things just aren't new. So we're going to need a dress, I think. It was really interesting, like looking into Rebecca Riots and everything that they stood for. I felt so many things resonate and felt just as if that I could be talking back then. Like the landlordism, I think that was a huge issue. And the culture, not everyone has to own their own home, I totally agree, but the culture of renting and the precarious situation that puts you in, nothing ever feels like it's yours. You're at the mercy of a landlord just going, do you know what, we've got to sell. And you know, it's really current, those riots, which is really fucking annoying, because actually you just think, well, what's changed? It just feels like this continuum, these things just will always happen. And what was also gross was the reporting. So they kind of sent a reporter in initially, and he kind of produced a really sympathetic view of events. I think he really bought into it and saw what they were fighting for and what they were about. But he then had to create this inquiry, I think, and that the inquiry just sugarcoated it all and said it was about the tolls, we've revised this, everything's fine.
They did bring reform, and they basically said, because they got to a point where if they smashed them up, they weren't replacing them, and then they scrapped the toll thing altogether. But that doesn't, you know, like the workhouses were still there, and it was still, you're so right, precarious and exploitative to be a tenanted farmer. None of those problems had gone away. They just, the symbolic stuff the tolls had, and you know, and you would argue that none of that's gone away even today. Isn't it something mad, like 60% of the cabinet, no more than that, 60% of the House of Commons are landlords, and then it's something mad like in the high 80s of the cabinet or the government that are landlords. So why would they possibly move legislation to be more in favour of tenants? Because it's against their own personal interests. And I just think that's so dark.
Yeah, it's really fucking macabre. It's gross. But that's what Wales has got on its side, is they can, like, that could be such a big policy thing for independence.
I hope to see in like the future of Wales, and if it goes independent or not, is that it never loses the feeling in its bones that you're there to fight for each other and fight for the people who aren't as lucky as you. You know, and that's, I hope that never goes. The sense of justice, I guess, social justice, and you know, I see it being fractured, you know, here and there, being largely influenced by, you know, I think external forces, but I think Wales has a really good history of fighting the power and sticking it to the man.
Ti eisiau fynd cyntaf neu?
Yeah, ga I fynd cyntaf. Okay, dwi'n meddwl mae Rebecca Riots yn ddiddorol iawn a tipyn bach o doniol, achos mae'n wastad doniol i clywed amdan dyn sy'n gwisgo ffroc. Hen RuPaul's Drag Race, da. Ond, dwi'n meddwl mae'n bwysig i cofio mae Cymru yn cael hanes hir o mlad am da a ymladd am pobl twlad a ymladd am rights o pobl, and dwi'n frawd iawn I dod o gwlad efo'r, calon mawr, efo llawer o compassion, a mae'n anodd I ymladd am y pethau da. I want to say the right thing, but ond mae'n bwysig I dangos y gwlad a y byd gyda'n gilydd, mae ni medra ennill. I think that's quite a bad sentence.
I think you were saying about Wales has got a long history of ymladd is fight, right?
Yeah.
So fighting for the right thing, showing the world, dangos y byd, that it's fighting for the right thing, and it's hard to fight for it. It's a hard thing to fight for, and something about winning.
Yeah, it's like together we can win, like, because that's what I think it is, isn't it? It's about collective social responsibility to each other and collective power, because I just think grassroots movements are the best way to do it, because it's the purest form of devolved power that you have. So yeah, I think it's nice to know that it's always been there and that we should never let it go away.
My unionism yn wastad yn neis I clywed amdan. Dwi'n really credu yn y power o pobl pwysyn gyd yn gilydd I newid popeth, o newid pethau. Dwi'n meddwl mae'n drist I dysgu amdan Rebecca Wright, achos just teimlo fel pethau dal yn newid, pethau just digwydd eto, a mae'n siomedig achos dwi'n really credu yn y power o pobl gyd yn gilydd, ond ddim yn medru rhoi examples sut mae'n gweithio. Ella mae'n gweithio I newid pethau bach, ond pethau mawr.
That you believe in like unions and the power of people to change things. I think you said popeth, which is everything, and then you changed to pethau, which is things, yeah? And then you're saying you feel like it's quite sad to learn about them because it feels like nothing changes because they're fighting the same thing that we want to fight now. And you're saying it's a shame because you really believe in that stuff, but at the same time you couldn't think of examples where it paid off. Ond dwi ddim yn cytuno achos pleidio.
So?
Yeah, we wouldn't have been able to vote 150 years ago, and we can now. So it can change, but it can't just be grassroots. That's what you have to realise is, like, yes, there was a grassroots, but it was also coming, like, the suffragettes had very powerful women involved and wealthy women involved, and all the men had died in the war, so they just needed them to make up the numbers. Os ti ddim yn cael extension, ti'n tyfersig, yeah?
Yeah, fuming. Just to go down in history, the extension riots.
You chained to your thing outside on a hunger strike. It chained up, but still eating packets of quavers.
That wouldn't fucking last a hunger strike. I would have been an awful suffragette.